Now, some of you are thinking, how did he do that? Others of you are thinking, why the hell did he do that? You saw this sash go through my neck, but you know it didn't do that. It couldn't do that. I did it to implant three things visually in your minds. One, that what we get isn't always what we expect. We need to expect the unexpected. Two, that the reason something happens isn't always what it seems at first glance. And three, and this is super important for actuaries, that real life is not always rational and logical. Yet as risk professionals, and as a company director, I too am a risk professional, most of our work and our training is about rationality and logic, what's often called left brain thinking. And up there on the slide is the classic way of defining left and right brain thinking, the differences. And your institute's website lists 8 core skills about what an actuary's capabilities should be and are. I read them, and they're fairly similar to what you see on the left brain side. They're largely about technical prowess, analysis, logic, rationality, numeracy, and, importantly also, judgment. But there's judgment and there's judgment. Not all judgment is good judgment. Remember Fairfax? Fairfax, that used to be an independent print media company that's now owned by Nine. It has the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, the Brisbane Times, and all of that kind of thing. For decades, Fairfax cruised on what they called a river of gold of classified advertising. Remember that? They owned that space. That river of gold for them was like an annuity. It came in and year out. What happened? The internet happened. And Fairfax poo-pooed it. The classified ads flowed onto the internet. Their river of gold dried up and the gold turned to dust. Fairfax did exercise judgment. In hindsight, very, very bad judgment. So, how can all of us avoid being a Fairfax? How can we help our organisations avoid being a Fairfax? How can we avoid the perils of hindsight, those if only we thought of that moments that many of us have faced? Now, today I'll be making some suggestions, and if you follow them, you'll still make some mistakes, but hopefully fewer of them. But before I explain, let me give you some context. As you heard from Vanessa, I live in 2 worlds. The corporate world, a world of real life, hard reality that most of us share, and the world of fiction, where I write crime thrillers. Now, at first glance, those 2 worlds are quite distinct. Like a Venn diagram, you'd separate them out just like that. The corporate world, more left brain, like an actuary. The fiction world, more right brain. And you'd be right, but you'd also be wrong. Because, at least in my life, the 2 worlds overlap. And my first suggestion to you all is that they should overlap for you too. What I've discovered is that using both competencies in each of my worlds helps me to be more effective at both. A better director, a better thriller writer. Now let's start with writing thrillers. It's a given that I have to credibly get into the mind of my villains. Otherwise, if I don't, you'll stop reading. So I've had to work quite hard to develop my ability to think like a villain, like a bad person. A less dramatic way to say that is I've had to train myself to use my imagination a lot more than I would ordinarily do. But here's my point. Imagination, and even thinking like a bad person, is also extremely helpful in business. And I don't mean by ripping people off. I mean in thinking about the challenges and the risks. It's useful in the boardroom. It's useful in the executive leadership team. It's useful in the risk committee, etc. The key message that I want to leave with you today is that imagination is something that you have to work on. You have to develop it. You have to train it. And I'd encourage you to think of it as important a tool as your technical prowess. Now, if me saying it isn't enough to convince you, here's Albert Einstein saying much the same thing. Imagination is more important than knowledge. This is the guy who invented the theory of relativity. Knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world. So how do we use our imagination more in real life, in business life? We do it by allowing ourselves to be seemingly irrational, seemingly illogical. And I say seemingly, but what you'll discover when you start doing it is it isn't even remotely irrational. To do this, we do this by intentionally opening up our minds to unconventional thinking, to challenge received wisdom, even to challenge our own intuition. As Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, says, the difference between what he calls System 1 and System 2 thinking, the automatic and the contemplative, or what Edward de Bono talked about in his 1985 book, Six Thinking Hats, as black hat thinking, putting on the black hat and letting yourself think like a bad person, which is what I'm saying. Doing this is not as hard as you might think, but doing it publicly in front of your colleagues, it can feel uncomfortable. It can feel embarrassing. Challenging conventional wisdom, challenging the mood of the room, it takes courage because it's natural to worry that your colleagues might think less of you. So it's asking the so-called dumb questions, those questions that suggest you're failing to grasp the mood of the room, the things that they are taking for granted. And people like us, people like you, really, really smart people, we hate to be seen as dumb. Now, I used to fall for that trap until one of my mentors said to me, "John, there are no such thing as dumb questions. There are only dumb answers." So strike out the word not. Go ahead and do ask those dumb questions. But don't let yourself think of them as dumb questions. Think of them as, how can I help avoid us becoming Fairfax? Ask the what-if questions more often. You know, what if we're wrong? This is what we all think, but what if we're wrong? What if this happened? What if that happened? Ask them more often, more creatively, more openly, and more purposefully, and don't be embarrassed about them. So I'm arguing that as good people, we also need to carry in our minds the bad person. We need to think about the bad things that could happen. Now, not all the time, hell no. We need to stay good people, that's what we are, but we need to force our brains to travel down those paths. This doesn't happen intuitively or naturally. You need to work at it, to train yourself to do it. Now, writing fiction is like going to the gym every day and training my mind to think like a bad person. Now, if you're not inclined to write fiction or you don't have the time to, then I'd encourage you to read more of it or watch more drama and kind of infuse in yourself those scenarios and allow yourself to think about them in terms of your daily work life. Now, to demonstrate my message, I want to give a couple of examples of how thinking like a thriller writer has helped me in the boardroom and how thinking like a director has helped me as a novelist. Before I became a writer, I often had that fairly common experience that I felt the premise of a novel was so ridiculous that it was unbelievable, so ridiculous that I might stop reading or watching the show. Have you all had that experience? Have any of you had that? Yes, I see quite a few hands. Well, I don't think that way anymore. A few things changed my mind. This guy, another fellow with wild hair and a moustache, Mark Twain, he said it's actually truth that's stranger than fiction, because fiction has to make sense for the reason that I mentioned a moment ago. But also, some of my real-life experiences changed my mind. The first time this happened to me was when I sent the manuscript of my first novel to an agent. It was 23 years ago, in 2001. The agent loved the novel, but he said to me, part of my plot was so far-fetched, so extreme, that no one would believe it. I would have to rewrite the book. Except 1 month later, 1 month, precisely what I'd imagined, what I'd put down on the page, happened. That was September 11, 2001, when terrorists destroyed the Twin Towers, which was what I was told was too far-fetched a month earlier. I'd thought like a bad person. I'd used my imagination. Sadly, so had the bad people. But the intelligence services, the CIA and the NSA in America, they did not. Do you remember what the US government's 9/11 Commission said in its report a couple of years later? And I'm quoting here. The reason, they say, the reason the intelligence agencies failed to prevent the September 11 attacks was due to a failure of imagination. So what I learned from that single, shocking, real-life episode, and I learned this for both my writing brain and my corporate brain, was that we should all consider elevating failure of imagination as a key business risk. And I mean that quite seriously. Think about it this way. If someone like me can dream this up, or someone like you, even more importantly, if you can think of this scenario, maybe it can happen. Maybe that scenario is worth spending some time on and thinking about from a mitigation point of view. Maybe it's a Fairfax moment for your organisation. This kind of thinking isn't new, and it's not unique to me. I mentioned Kahneman, I mentioned De Bono. There's also a fantastic 2007 article in the Harvard Business Review by Gary Klein that talks about pre-mortems. Now, we all know what a post-mortem is. It's when you examine the dead body to find out why they died and how. A pre-mortem is the hypothetical opposite. You actually do a pre-mortem in an organisation before you start the project, before you finalise the design of the product, before you do the transaction. And what you do is you say, we assume it will fail. Why could it have failed? And therefore, you're giving yourself the license to ask those really dumb questions. You're giving yourself the license to act like a bad person. Now, the example I gave of September 11 and the Twin Towers is a case where thinking like a bad person in fiction turned out not to be so dumb at all. Here's another example, but this one started in the boardroom. And it led to fiction, and that it also led to some sad reality, which I'll mention. This time we're in 2010. I'm on the board of an insurance company. Let's say that it starts with the letter Q. I'd just taken the chair of the risk committee. Back then, cyber wasn't on very many people's minds. They hadn't even heard the word at that time. But it was on mine because of an experience I'd had on another board. I knew, for example, that there was a thing, a systems access level, called super user privileges. Not many other people did back then. Certainly not on boards. And that's where you've got to have someone with absolutely unlimited privilege across a network, so you can change whatever you need to change. You can put in backdoors, you can close settings, etc. So I asked our chief risk officer in the meeting, a smart, highly trusted person, also an actuary, therefore by definition really smart, tell us who had the super user privileges in the company. And he said, I do, just me. And I said, but what if you're a bad person? I said, not even the US president, thank goodness, has the code for the football, the nuclear football. It's shared. So what if you're a bad person? What if you're a disgruntled employee? What if you are blackmailed? You're under duress for some reason. What if you make a mistake? After all, we're all human, even actuaries. Now, as you'd expect, we changed the system after that. Pretty basic, right? Except 3 years later, 3 years after we did it at Kew, Edward Snowden abused superuser privileges at no less than the NSA in America and leaked 1 million highly confidential documents, and he's now enjoying Vladimir Putin's hospitality in Russia. So again, another failure of imagination by security services, not at Kew. So I took that board experience and the NSA example and wrote one of my novels called The Trusted that year in 2013. It's entirely about cyber risk from insiders. And I imagined 10 scenarios, ridiculous to some at the time, shutting down a gas pipeline in America. Well, that happened 8 years later with Colonial Pipeline. Disrupting GPS and aviation services. This happened for Estonia just last week. In fact, at the time, the head of ASIO read the novel and he told me, John, this should not be on the fiction shelves. This novel is non-fiction. This is real. We are worrying about all this stuff. So, what I'm really saying is that in our increasingly complex, fast-moving world, and we haven't even talked about AI. I mean, you have earlier, but I haven't talked about it. Thinking only like good people, not using our imagination, is a luxury that we cannot afford. Remember, learn to expect the unexpected, work on how to profit from it or preempt it. Thank you.